Welcome back to the afternoon session. So one thing that we will discover immediately is the breadth of the interest that Bill Demopoulos and Howard Stein and George Smith pursued. We're switching to a quite different set of topics than in the wonderful talks from the morning. So we'll be talking more about issues in general philosophy of science. But again, we get to welcome back one of our alumna that we're very proud of. So Molly Ko has finished her PhD at Western in 2016. I was surprised that it was that long ago. Yeah. So, and her thesis was on evaluating the quantum postulate in the context of pursuit, supervised by Wayne Mervold. And she's gone on to the Université de Montréal, where she's now an associate professor and has broadened her interest to include now philosophy of statistics and statistical inference. And so it's a really great pleasure to welcome back a graduate who's done so well. And so Molly's going to talk to us today about blind analysis as coherence testing. So take it away, Molly.
Is it okay that this light is red also? That's good? Okay. And then this works here as well? Okay, great. Well, thank you for everyone for being here, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. So I assume this is the clicker here. Great. Okay, so as Chris mentioned, we're kind of moving into a more general philosophy of science area, and in particular, what I'll be talking about is kind of based around this this group of techniques that are called blind analysis that I'll be telling you about, that I got interested in part because I was talking to a physicist just casually, and he said to me, "Oh, there's this thing that's really interesting that could be that maybe you want to look at because it might have like epistemic things, implications." So I did get interested in it, and so of course, we all know that experiment or bias can occur when researchers often unknowingly influence the results of an experiment. So maybe the most well-known example of trying to prevent experiment or bias comes in double-blind clinical trials. So we know, for instance, that clinicians and researchers might treat patients differently, patients might act differently, and so we try and improve the data, we try and improve kind of the data that we're obtaining by eliminating sources of whatever the personal bias might be. So in kind of the literature on bias and the literature in science and values that talks about bias, we do have a lot of these examples that come from, say, biology, social sciences, and medicine, but there's been comparatively less interest in how that might arise in the context of physics. So there are some people who have paid attention to this, but relatively few. So I'll name like Alan Franklin, for instance, and Ken Staley, who have worked on some of these issues in the context of kind of what they're interested in. But just to go back, so experiment or bias can arise in physics, and in particular, the context that I'm talking about is in high energy physics, in experimental particle physics. So I'll talk more about practices of blind analysis, but this idea of blind analysis, these are these techniques that are meant to counteract these biases in the context of experiments in high energy particle physics. And so, as I said, I think that theorization of these techniques has been limited, and cross-discipline discussions of these techniques has been limited, despite the fact that these techniques are largely statistical, and of course, statistical reasoning models are used in, it's hard to name a science maybe now that doesn't use some kind of statistical reasoning. So just to start with the very general problem, collecting and interpreting massive amounts of data, as we know that's what happens in high energy physics when we're talking about our particle colliders, requires making various choices at various points of the analysis of an experiment. And so what I mean is, of course, when we do a high kind of an experiment in high energy physics, when we run our particle accelerator, we get massive amounts of data in terms of the results of the interactions, the results of the collisions. And it's not that this just tells us, for example, whether we have a positive signal. There's a lot of data analysis that we have to run in order to come to a conclusion. But those models that we're using, the kind of analysis that we're running, the choices of what we do at various points, I'll go into more detail, they're not uniquely dictated by the data. And so, of course, when we have things that are not uniquely dictated by the data in this way, this opens the door to, the possibility that non-empirical considerations will come into play. So these are places where we might see confirmation bias. We might see confirmation bias in the sense that physicists might want to find a particular effect, and so they will that will influence the decisions that they make in order to interpret the results of the experiment. So physicists introduced these techniques of blind analysis to counteract these biases, but the importance and applicability of these techniques can still be contentious. So they are used in various ways, and so I will just tell you something anecdotal because I don't have. hopefully that's still interesting. So when you read some of the articles that are talking about blind analysis, I'll bring out a little more information about kind of how it's used and how people react to the results, but these are also conversations that, for the most part, the justifications of blind analysis are not something that is worked out in writing. The choice of particular techniques are not necessarily worked out, and the choice of particular techniques that are used in particular contexts are not necessarily put into the articles. A lot of the time, these are kind of lunchroom discussions that you're having with your collaboration group or with your collaborators, where you're trying to decide, okay, is this important? How should we do this? What's the best way? And it's contentious in part because, of course, when you do something like a blind analysis, there are trade-offs in terms of how quickly you can get the analysis done, how quickly you can come to the results. And so you always have to decide whether it's worth it to go through this process in order to counteract any possible, but not definite biases, because, as we know, experimenter bias is not systematic in a way that we can kind of quantify. So debates about these issues tend to be conducted informally, and so I'm hoping that kind of more work on the theorization of these techniques can kind of help kind of make the discussion, give the discussion a little more form. So that's one of the ultimate goals. And so the kind of overall question is, so how should we characterize the inferential and justificatory role of the use of techniques of blind analysis? And of course, that's very general because the techniques are not just one thing. They're very specific to kind of the experiment that's being done. But the kinds of reviews, the presentations of blind analysis techniques, they tend to be presented, and of course this makes sense, they tend to be presented in terms of how or what kind of bias they can help to prevent. So, whether it's stopping bias or a confirmation bias. So we tend to classify, one way of classifying blind analysis techniques is in terms of what kind of bias they can prevent. Another type of way to classify blind analysis techniques that is kind of what is being hidden. And so the hope is also to kind of tease out the kind of philosophical classification of what's happening with these techniques. So another kind of ultimate goal is to know whether understanding the role of these techniques might help us to clarify how they might or might not be applied in other areas. So one of the ways that the physicists who have written on this, they have, for example, collaborated with one psychologist who, of course, psychology is also a heavily statistical discipline. But so far, the techniques of blind analysis, for the most part, have not been adopted in that discipline. And so we might ask, well, is there a principled reason why not? Is there something in kind of the structure of the techniques that makes it impossible to adopt? But again, clear kind of analyses of these techniques hopefully will contribute to these kinds of discussions. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about these blind analysis techniques in high energy physics. And so what I'll try to do today is kind of use some of the concepts presented by Elisa Bokalic, who's written on coherence, calibration, consilience, and her work is very much in the line of George Smith, kind of Bill Harper. People have written on evidence in this way, on theory-mediated measurements. So I'm going to try and understand how certain blind analysis techniques can be understood in the context of the concepts used in coherence arguments, calibration arguments. Okay, so to go back to the context of blind analysis. So most of what I've looked at so far are techniques that have been adopted in the context of experiments conducted at the particle physics, the particle accelerators in California and in Japan, and in the context of trying to test CP violations through B-meson decay. So I chose these in part because these two that are called the Babar and Bell collaborations respectively, particularly in the Babar collaboration, blind analysis techniques are actually quite, so they're valued quite highly, and they're actually discussed pretty explicitly in ways that it's a little harder to find in some of the other literature. So in a lot of their documents, they actually outline the kinds of techniques that are used, and in their internal collaboration, one of the things that happens before they kind of approve external submission or publication is actually internally they evaluate the group one another to see whether they used blind analysis in their experiment. So, of course, blind analysis is not unique to these collaborations. It's also it's also used by LIGO. There are other people who would know all about that. So, but as I said, most of the things that I have looked at so far come from the Babar collaboration. And in case you're wondering, they did name it after the little French bear. So, but pardon?
Babar is an elephant.
Oh, that's what I meant. Yes, of course. The elephant in the little green suit. Okay, so to go over some things that many people already know, just some examples of experiments that we might do using these high-energy particle accelerators. So, of course, there are different kinds of experiments that we might do. And when I'm going to give an example of what we call an easy case and a hard case. I mean, they're easy cases and hard cases, both for blind analysis and perhaps in general. So a relatively easy case or an easy type of experiment that we might do in the context of these of particle higher energy physics is to look for a rare decay. So we know that the standard model of particle physics makes predictions about rare decays upon the collisions of certain types of particles. We know that it will make certain predictions about kind of the statistical regularity with which we will find certain decays, certain breakdowns. What are the particles that will be created upon these statistically upon these collisions? And so if we know that, if we have an idea of how frequently we should expect to see certain particles created upon the collision of whatever other particles we started with, then in that sense, there's a signal region that can be specified. In other words, we know roughly where to look, what kinds of particles, roughly what the mass and energies will be that will indicate that we are seeing evidence of this particular particular decay. So in that sense, the signal region is specified. And so it's an easier case because of all of the data that we get, of all of the possible collisions, of all the energies and masses that we record, we have an idea of where to look to see whether there is evidence of the decay that is predicted or not. And so one of the tasks that we might have is to determine whether sufficient signal has been detected to give evidence of this rare decay. So, of course, I'm simplifying because one thing we can say is whether there is sufficient signal is detected for evidence of the decay. Another thing we can do is to put an upper limit on on the branching functions. And so there are different things we can do, but starting from the standard model and making our predictions about what we should see in particular cases of collisions gives us this information. Of course, there are other kinds of experiments. For example, if we are kind of conducting a search for a new particle, which is part of the work of looking for beyond the standard model. And so if we're looking for evidence of a new particle whose properties aren't completely known, then in that case, we don't know which region to look in. We don't know where necessarily to expect what would constitute excess signal above whatever the background might be. And so that makes it more difficult, and particularly when our simulations aren't necessarily rich enough to provide a reliable background estimate. So as I said, these are kinds of examples of an easy case and a hard case, not just for kind of finding the results, but also for applying techniques of blind analysis. So just to give an example of what this might look like, in the results of an experiment, if we're looking at kind of, the detections of a certain number of events where we have a certain number of particles with a particular mass and a particular energy, then if we know where to look, then there is a signal region that's specified. And outside of that signal region, we have information in the sideband region about what kind of background we might expect. So of course we have these millions, that might be understating it, interactions every second. And again, each of these interactions produces whatever particles, and the results are, again, detected and recorded. That's a simplification, but the question is, which results do we attribute to background interactions versus our signal of interest? So again, to kind of give the general motivation for why use techniques of blind analysis. So if we're looking for the value of a parameter, and we have to calculate this parameter using some function that must be determined by experimenters, this is what we're doing when we're trying to kind of read off the results of an experiment. And it's not that simple, but when we read off the results of an experiment, when we're trying to decide if we've found evidence for a rare decay or something. So maybe we're trying to find the number of positive events, maybe we're trying to find the upper limit, but no matter what, our function d of x is based on the various steps of statistical analysis where we're trying to optimize certain variables, and all of these kinds of choices about like optimization different choices in these processes will lead to different values of theta for the same data set. And if experimenters know already what the data are when we're doing the calculation, then this can affect their choice of whatever this function might be. So as to just kind of express this idea, it's dangerous to optimize a selection with the actual data that is to be used in the measurement. So such an approach is prone to tuning on fluctuations and the production of biases. So if we have outliers, but we see these outliers in our data, we are prone to kind of this influences our choices of, say, where to place cuts on what to include as events or not to include as events. So, as I said, blind analysis refers to a diverse group of techniques developed to counter possible experimenter bias. And again, they're not meant to counter systematic effects, so it's hard to quantify, but the goal is to, since we can't really estimate it, it's preferable to prevent it if possible. And so I won't go through all of the techniques of blind analysis, but we'll just talk a little bit more about two in particular. And I'll just describe a couple of other ones. And so in the hidden signal box, this one is pretty commonly used, actually, especially in cases of the search for rare decay, where we will just hide a portion of the data. So if we have an idea of where we should be observing the signal to indicate kind of the observation of the particles that are produced upon the decay, then we can hide the data in that area, in that part of the box over there. And then at that point, we hide the data in the expected region of the signal. And then just as an example, what we might say is, well, okay, so now we have an estimate of the background. We have an estimate of what would be there based on everything else that is not our signal of interest. And so we can use analysis to calculate how many events have to be detected in order to count as having evidence for the interaction that we were looking for, the decay that we were looking for. So if that's the case, then again, if we already did that without hiding that signal box, then the danger is kind of expecting to see the signal, and so essentially, I mean, again, simplifying, but essentially choosing our background in such a way that there are enough events over and above the background to count as positive evidence. So again, the hidden signal box, this technique is used quite a lot in searches for rare decay. And right, so as I said, the background has to be calculated to determine which events to cut. So so this one is maybe interesting in the sense that so this is a technique that the physicists talk about it as data prescaling, but it is certainly something that has become very common now in other areas, particularly in training of models. This is not something that I know very much about, other than secondhand. But in this case, the chain of analysis is developed based on a portion of the data before being applied to all of it to yield the final result. So when we're talking about data prescaling, we take part of the data, and then we develop our analysis, and then we check to see whether it makes sense once we've unblinded, once we've revealed the data that we had hidden. So one of the interesting things about this is that the blinding is usually partial. So the physicists who are using these techniques still talk about it as a blind analysis. They still say that they've blinded it or they've unblinded it. But of course, it's not a total blinding, because it's not that they've hidden all of the relevant data. They're still using part of the data, so part of the observation, to create their model. And then they go back and kind of like check it. So those are, I'll come back to this one as well when talking about the coherence arguments. But just as an example, as a couple other, so some other techniques, again, all of them depend very highly on what it is that you're doing. So in a hidden offset, you might insert a parameter that's unknown to the experimenter in the analysis. You do your whole analysis, and at the end, you kind of remove that parameter to correct. And so you get an answer that you didn't know. You can add events, you can seed events so that you know that your data set is not representative of what you actually have. And so you run your analysis on this data set that you know is not precise. And then you take away those events to get your final answer. You can do a divided analysis, so not a redundant analysis in the sense that you're getting robustness, but you kind of divide up your analysis between two groups so that you have to combine the answers before you have to combine the analyses of the two groups in order to get the final answer. So in that sense, part of the risk of the answer is blinded for part of the group. And so again, all of these are techniques that are developed to eliminate the possibility of experimenter bias. And as I said, each is particular to the type of experiment and the analyses being undertaken. Okay, so one thing that I thought was interesting, so a physicist who wrote on this says, blind analysis brings particle physics into line with best practice from other branches of science. It is more a formalization of good experimental practice than a radical new idea. So I thought that was interesting because it was not totally clear what he meant about best practice from other branches of science. So again, there are analogies to kind of blinding various parts of an experiment in clinical trials. And I think generally we understand that eliminating experimenter bias insofar as possible is a good thing. But again, it's not something that's necessarily explicitly discussed by a large group. It's more just that groups have adopted it in their work. So just to go back to the analogy, so in clinical trials, when we make these trials double-blind, the idea is, I think, that we're making we're making the data more reliable. And so in the physics context, it's not just the quality of the data, but the calculational technique that's more reliable. So the measurement outcome is more reliable when we eliminate the experimenter bias. So that was kind of just an overview of the blind analysis technique. So now I'll just talk a little bit about these concepts, particularly in the way that Elisa Bokalic introduced them. And so Elisa Bokalic draws on work by George Smith, by Iran Tal in the philosophy of measurement, and among others, to argue for a distinction between three concepts that she says are sometimes often conflated. So she talks about coherence, calibration, and consilience. And so, of course, there's a lot of discussion of how coherence can contribute to, say, various, there are various arguments for why coherence is desirable. But Elisa Bokalic talks more about coherence testing as something that she takes from, she gives the example of George Smith's work. So I'm kind of trying to see if these distinctions provide a framework. I'm using them as a framework for interpreting how blind analysis techniques shape the overall reasoning in kind of our evaluation of our experimental results. So in Bokalic's example, she talks about radiographic dating, in which different methods are used for establishing geological ages. And so in her example, you might have two dating methods that disagree about characterizing the geological age. And so she says scientists have to decide how to adjust one or both of them. So if you have two dating methods that disagree, then one thing that you can do is to intercalibrate the two methods. But then you lose the force of the argument from independent lines of evidence. Because, of course, if you have two independent ways of dating and they agree, then you get kind of a robustness argument, you get a consilience argument. But once you've made them dependent on each other, then you no longer get that. So her view is that following basically George Smith's work on how discrepancies between data, between theory and observation actually teach us something about where to look. She says that discordant data, we can use discordant data to revise background information, and we can do that to improve each method independently. So according to her, at least in the geological context, coherence precedes calibration and consilience. And it's a process where scientists learn from the discordant lines of evidence. So again, I cite George Smith, I cite Bill Harper on the idea of kind of using these theory-mediated measurements to guide us from not testing hypotheses in the sense of rejecting or accepting hypotheses, but using these tests to show that when there are kind of small regular discrepancies, that these are things that need to be explained they are things that need to be explained by other phenomena. So in that sense, we use this information to learn more. And then she talks about calibration, which has to do with establishing a reliable relation between a measurement indication and the relevant feature of the object being measured. And so there is, of course, a lot of literature in philosophy of measurement and philosophy of kind of empiricism on how calibration is difficult and needs kind of empirical tools and analyses to be able to say when something is well calibrated. But it requires adjusting our measurement instruments. And here, it requires adjusting measurement instruments. According to Bakulich, it comes after the initial coherence testing. And these kinds of measurement instruments, because when we're talking about heavily model and theory influenced kind of measurements, as is certainly the case in particle physics, then adjusting our measurement instruments includes models and calculational techniques. And she distinguishes this from consilience in the style of William Whewell, where, again, a type of robustness argument where we have reason to think that something is better supported or more plausible when we have multiple independent lines of evidence leading to the same conclusion. Okay, so I want to say that if we try and think of these three C's, the coherence and calibration and consilience, we can see how they play out in some of these techniques, and of course in determining the results of the outcomes in measurements and high energy physics in general. So I want to say that blind analysis techniques contribute to the calibration of the model, yielding the measurement result. And so again, here I'm thinking of the result of an experiment as a measurement outcome. So of course, depending on what the experiment is, it might be a different, we don't know what the outcome is, but it might be the amount of signal detected. And this has to be based on an instrument indication. So again, in the philosophy of measurement, there is this distinction between the measurement outcome, which is kind of attributes a value to the object of interest. And that's different from the instrument indication, which is what we're reading off of our experiment. So if we're taking our indications to be, well, we have various levels of instrument indications. We have the detected and recorded events at one level, and of course, after various amounts of analyses, we have, so we know that we don't have, all of the events are not necessarily recorded, so there are various processes for already skimming the data and picking some of the data, and then at the next level of analysis that allows us to represent kind of what we think are appropriate amounts of background and signal. And it's only once these are all analyzed we can talk about a measurement outcome. Again, if we're looking for evidence of a rare decay, that we say that we have a certain amount of signal that's been detected. So the blind analysis techniques contribute to calibration. The result of a blind analysis, but the result of a blind analysis in general, which is the measurement outcome is the result, is used overall in a coherence test in the sense that this reflects kind of what the physicists do once they unblind their data. So I don't really concentrate on consilience, but this can occur in redundant analyses where we might do multiple analyses on the same data. Different groups might do, similar experiments, or different groups might use the same data but do different analyses. But so in the case of the hidden signal box, to go back to that particular technique, I think one of the interesting things is that, from what I know of double-blind clinical trials, it's not that we take the data and then at the end we kind of will. I mean, we don't need to actually. Anyway, maybe I will not say that. Okay, so in the case of the hidden signal box, once the region is revealed, so as I said, once we've done the analysis and the region is revealed, several situations might arise, and some of them might be ambiguous. So there are some straightforward cases, of course, where maybe no signal was detected, or there was a significant signal, and that makes sense based on what we expected to see in our decay. And so in those cases, the conclusions are straightforward. But there are ambiguous events when there are events in the box, but what Klein and Rudman say are these events in the box are clearly due to background or significant signal is found, but inconsistent with predictions. And so even once you unblind the data, it's not that now all of a sudden an unblinded data set is kind of the ultimate the kind of ultimate gold standard for a result. Instead, what they're doing is looking at the results of the unblinded data and trying to, and this is what I'm calling the coherence test, where they're trying to see, in the same way that we see are our observations coherent with our theory, are the results of our blinded analysis coherent with our theoretical expectations. So if there's a significant signal is found, but it actually it just doesn't make sense based on kind of the theoretical predictions. That does not mean that in the end, you have to classify each of those events as a signal. Or if you find events that seem contrary to what was expected to be more background, to be more indicative of background than signal evidence of the event, then it's a part of the analysis not to say that the blinded information is primary, but to look at the results and say, something seems to have gone wrong. And so they're doing this test. They might actually redo the analysis based on this information. So again, there is no gold standard here of kind of blind analysis is like the best way and gives us the ultimately correct kind of analysis. So if we're measuring the number of signal events, using a blind analysis, I claim, improves the calibration of the measurement process by reducing a source of possible error, but it doesn't reduce it by a quantitative, it's not a quantifiable amount. And the larger result of this chain of reasoning is itself subject to a coherence test. So again, kind of the epistemic force of the blind analysis seems to perhaps be it's not so clear how we might classify that. So in the case of the data prescaling, where, as I said, some or all of the data is hidden, and then an analysis is conducted on, well, sometimes it's a combination of experimental data from different runs, sometimes it's simulational data, sometimes it's data from outside the signal region that we'll use. So the signal region data is not used in the analysis, but in at least some of the articles that I looked at, the physicists again call this a blind analysis. And so again, they didn't use the signal region data in the actual kind of statistical optimization, but they did use it qualitatively to determine when corrections had to be made. So again, they're kind of using the result of the run as like a coherence test with these other things that they have information about already. And so they seem to look at it and say, well, we need to revise the models of our background in order for this to be more coherent. So again, it's not a gold standard. It's always subject to these coherence checks. And as I said, there are different ways to react once the analysis is unblinded, depending on the result. And again, if the results are too discordant with our theoretical expectations, we might rerun parts of the analysis with some of the originally blinded data, or we could not do that, and then we can try to recalculate uncertainties based on some of the signal region data. So there are a lot of ways to try and improve, kind of make different assumptions, to revise our background information, as Bakulich says, based on the information that we get from the results of these tests. Again, the kind of blinding process in the prescaling comes with a lot of trade-offs, because if we just if we blind everything, if we hide all the data, that's when we're most subject to kind of tuning on the data and perhaps cognitive biases. But if we blind all of the data, then it seems like we don't have really good information available. We have to know if the data that we're kind of building our models on is any good, if the simulated data is accurate or too model laden or theory laden. So usually the actual process of prescaling, data prescaling, goes somewhere in between, either by using only part part of the data, or by doing part of the optimization process and then blinding the data and then finishing the optimization process. So there are all these ways where it becomes harder to kind of classify exactly the level of blinding that's happening because of the fact that it's not a straightforward, hide the data in a signal region. So again, to get back to this idea of the coherence test, and the results of a blinded analysis serve as a check on the theoretical expectations. So just in the same way that when our observations are not coherent with with what we expected, then we have to go back and try and revise our background knowledge, where it might be our background models, where it might be the algorithms that we're using to do the optimization. And so if these kinds of the theoretical expectations and the experimental results disagree, you have to make a judgment call about how to make them coherent. And so some of the cases, if you kind of just call it a day and say, we'll calculate the uncertainties, so that's one kind of thing that you can report on. Sometimes that will still allow you to give, say, upper limits on the branching functions. But if you decide to rerun the analysis with more information or changed background information or modified models in the background, then we get an example of kind of the iterative process of improving the concordance between our theoretical predictions and our experimental results. So that, again, is just kind of putting this in the framework of kind of the kind of empiricism that's talked about by George Smith. So one thing to note, though, as I said, is that when we get, it just really becomes difficult to not just quantify, but even classify the epistemic contribution of the original blinding process, except in terms of, it seems like the original blinding process is less valuable as avoiding experimenter bias per se. It's more valuable as one step in the coherence testing process. So that's kind of the idea. So just as kind of to conclude, which this is good timing, certain techniques of blind analysis improve not only the calibration of a measurement, which is what I claim is happening when you're eliminating experimenter bias, but also generate results that serve as coherence checks between theory and observation. So just to make a little contrast with the way that Elisa Bokulich was talking about these 3 C's in her work on radiographic dating. So in her work, she talks about how they are conceptually distinct. And the way that she classified it in her example, I wouldn't necessarily say that she would make a claim to universality, but for the way that Bokulich was characterizing these, she talked about kind of this coherence testing as being prior to acts of calibration and arguments of consilience. But I think that when you're trying to kind of tease out various levels of evaluating the measurement outcome of a high energy experiment that's using all of these models, then it is important to keep these conceptually distinct because that helps us better to understand what is kind of epistemically useful about something like blind analysis. But of course, they're much more entangled in the non-technical sense of procedurally entangled. So I think that's another. And so I had mentioned that Alan Franklin has worked on blind analysis. And so Alan Franklin has talked about how blind analysis is one of these things that helps kind of to justify the reliability of experimental results. His target is largely kind of social constructivists, and so he wants to give an account of why accounts are reliable, and so he does talk about blind analysis as one of these ways to try and eliminate bias without necessarily kind of talking about the inferential roles that it plays. So finally, this is something that hopefully can be further developed, this idea of the transparency of use. I had said that people who are using these techniques like they report on them in their articles, but a lot of kind of the debate of whether to use them or not is very is informal. And so it would be interesting if kind of thinking more in these terms, these factors of kind of epistemic roles could make it more clear, at least provide a language to talk about the weighting of the trade-offs in the trade-offs when adopting the techniques or not. So lots of questions to explore still. So there are a lot of methods that I didn't talk about and that I have to look at further and that I have to look at in more detail in order to kind of like understand in more detail these different evidential structures. I kind of gave this general idea of like it fits into the coherence testing, there's calibration, but there's a lot more to be said on if you look closer into the techniques and into the different techniques that are there. And again, I just kind of have this open question of the possible applications in other contexts. Is blind analysis used in other disciplines? If not, why not? Are there principled reasons? If not, should it be? And again, I think working out kind of details of how the reasoning works can help us to understand better whether it should be or could be applied in other cases if it is not. Okay, well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Molly. So I will keep a queue of questions, but I'll abuse my position as moderator. So I was very struck by something you said at the outset, which is that the collaborations, Babar and Bell, use this as an internal evaluation. Like, have you done blind analysis in your experimental analysis? So it's clear that they accept it as some kind of standard for rigorous experimental work. But from what you've said, it seems like there isn't a generally accepted justification for why that's part of the standard, or...
Well, I would say that the justification is to eliminate experimenter bias.
Right.
And the idea is that if we can, why not?
Mm-hmm.
But we know that sometimes it becomes too costly, and we know that sometimes it goes wrong, hence the coherence checks. And so we understand if it's not like it's going to be, we will only allow something to be submitted for publication if it was a completely blind analysis that came out right. But it's like, this idea that, to upstream, we should try and institute this if possible.
But it did seem like there's a lot of different techniques that you can have, as
like
you described. So it's really interesting. So I guess the question I was struck by is sort of related to some of the questions you had at the end, which is there going to be one way of analyzing all the different things that people call blind analysis techniques? Or do you think that some of them are going to have a very different sort of epistemic justification than others, and as you said, sort of different evidential structures? So it might be that you have very different stories for the... Yeah,
no, I do think that they're going to be in the way that the techniques are particular to what's happening. I think the evidential, of course, like the central thing is, can we prevent experimenter bias? But I just don't think that preventing experimenter bias always means the same thing in other ways, like cashing out. So I definitely don't think that... I tried to say in these two particular techniques, there are ways that we can talk about coherence and calibration, but so I don't know if like redundant analyses is really something that's considered blind. Some people consider, the terminology is a little bit loose too, but that would be kind of like more of a consilience argument where you get people doing the analyses. I'm definitely not like committed to the idea that you'll just always kind of put out, this is a coherence testing, this is a whatever.
I'll just ask one more question, because I'm familiar with more cases involving like hidden offsets.
Right. Yeah.
And the cases that come to mind are cases where there's like a parameter you're trying to measure, which there's a known accepted value. And one of the virtues of the hidden offset kind of method is that you do all your systematics before you know what the answer you actually get is. Yeah. Because the thought is, if you know what the answer is, then you'll make sure your error bars are big enough that the accepted value fits within the error bars. So that's like a very specific, you don't want to sort of be, knowing that you're going to hit the target, because, and so the hidden offset prevents that kind of error.
And there's evidence that has happened. Like if you look at kind of the measurements of certain parameters, historically, you're like,
those are
a lot
Yeah.
more clustered than you would expect them to be,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah.
So there's like kind of people are thinking that that's some evidence. So yeah, I don't like if we're talking about the hidden offset, then that doesn't. I'd have to kind of think about it to see whether those are the best concepts to use to talk about, whether coherence is,
Right.
or whether it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe we will use the language of calibration in the sense of it's making our measurement, like even though the specific thing at the end about kind of making your error bars big enough is very
Right.
specific. It's like,
Right.
well, maybe we need to use some kind of distinction between, like if we talk about precision versus accuracy, how are we calibrating our kind of like measurement instrument and model in such a way to make it more like reliable.
Right. Good. I've been ignoring other people. Sorry. I'm supposed to bring this to you as well, so you have to use both mics.
Thanks. This was really interesting. I also wanted to ask about another case. I know you talked more of what you called like the easy case, but I'm wondering how well the like coherence idea fits when you're like searching for new, like maybe you don't know what you're looking for. You're searching for some signal of new physics, like what we're currently trying to do, going beyond the standard model. Because at least immediately, it doesn't seem to me that you'd have the ability to like go back and check.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the whole idea, is we don't really know what we're looking for. So yeah, I wonder if you could just say a bit about that.
Well, what I would say is that that's true, I don't have a good answer for that. And I don't know that coherence is the best way to think about that, because as I said, it's not just a hard case it's a hard case both for the experiments themselves and for blind analysis. So from what I've seen, it's like there's definitely a lot less kind of attempted application of blind analysis techniques to those hard cases, exactly because maybe there is no kind of like, you can't do the same kind of coherence testing. So yeah, I will definitely have to look more into that, but that is definitely like a concern for the actual blind analysis application also, let alone the epistemological, like the epistemic analysis of it.
Yeah. So you might wonder, whether it's really needed if you don't know what the signal
like what would it be coherent with if we don't really know? I mean, it's like more like a decoherence or an incoherence test with like the standard model.
Great. Simon?
Well, yes, I've just got a very small question, really. I look at the dates of these references and so forth. They are before, they precede the large scale AI models that are now available. I just wonder, what are the? Doesn't that make a difference somehow?
Yeah. So I mean, one thing I was going to say about the data prescaling is that is certainly. So I think some of the techniques are. So what I was going to say about data prescaling is that when we're talking about kind of like large data models, that is a standard thing. So they called it blind analysis in part because at that time that they were writing, it was like not standard. But then when you have massive amounts of data and you're training a model, that's what you have to do. That's just like a standard. You train your model on a part of the data and then you test it on another part of the data. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, but one of the issues about blind analysis is it suggests, anyway, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it suggests that it's something that could be somewhat outsourced to AI. It doesn't actually need whatever conceptual apparatus physicists might bring to bear on this sort of data analysis. Perhaps that isn't then going to be so salient, in which case AI-type methods perhaps becomes just as good. I mean, I wonder whether there's not the possibility that all of this is in a way going to be superseded by the use of AI systems. But then I wonder, might similar concerns arise for AI systems? I wonder if you've got
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely don't know enough about how AI might be or is applied in this context to know, but I would be worried about kind of thinking that that would solve the problem in the sense that, like, we know that AI models are incredibly successful in certain ways and also build in biases in other ways. So I'm not saying it's going to build in experimenter bias because that doesn't really make sense, but it's not clear to me that So if we have, for example, like AI giving us better background models, I'm just not sure that scientists stop making decisions about their analysis and their optimization just because AI tells us. Like, we still have to decide which of the models are more appropriate. And maybe AI tells us we put these cuts here, but at some point you kind of have to make a choice, and it should be better not to. Presumably, the idea is that it's better to make the choice without incorporating the signal data, right? So I'm not sure of the answer, basically, but I'm not convinced that these will become irrelevant.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. This was really interesting. I have a sort of a clarificatory question, because, I was always thinking of, I didn't know, as you said, there isn't much work on blind analysis in physics, at least in philosophy of science, but there's a lot of work in, philosophy of medicine and so on and so forth, and randomized trials and so on. And I always thought of in philosophy of statistics, and I always thought of this literature, and then say what the metrologists are doing when they talk about coherence tests that, at least the Vokalich is drawing from, is sort of addressing two different stages in the run of an experiment or in the setup of sort of a high precision measurement. And why? Because the kind of like a consilience evidence that you get sort of happens a step after making the judgment that the seemingly systematic effects that you pick up are not just like sort of flukes, right? So the first is sort of the epistemic question: have we actually detected something physical? And then the other question is, okay, what do we do if we are sure we have detected something physical, such as they did with this 2812 redefinition of the geological timescale? And the question is, okay, do we recalibrate or not? And if we do not recalibrate, at least there's the chance that we could come up with a physical explanation of why you had the discrepancy. In the end, we have a scale that rests on sort of more physical evidence. So I wonder if you think that's true, and if so, do you then think, okay, we can sort of do an analogy from the way we treat systematic errors to how we deal with like random errors, or maybe I'm just misunderstanding something.
No, so the question is the question, do I think that there are two different levels or two different kind of like distinct steps of when we're, say, taking a measurement and then drawing our conclusion, first of all? And then, is that for the first question? Sorry, I'm just trying to...
Yeah, sorry, no, I'm probably not clear. Basically, it's that when one talks about a coherence test, right, the cell level of analysis happens after. Like, there's two steps. One is about, do we have an effect or do we have a fluke? That's where the philosophy of statistics questions enter. The other one is, what do we do if we have a systematic discrepancy, right? And how does that bear on?
Yeah, so it's true that, so here we're not necessarily talking about kind of a systematic discrepancy. So there's certainly a disanalogy in the sense that we're not going to be able to go as deeply into kind of the, again, George Smith influenced, Phil Harper influenced, kind of what does this particular regular discrepancy tell us about how we should revise things? Like, I think that is not necessarily, if the discrepancy is due to, like, the discrepancies that will come up in what I'm calling the coherence testing and the result of a blind analysis, it's not going to be clear what that is, and it's not going to be clear what the cause of that discrepancy is. And because that discrepancy is not necessarily going to be systematic or regular, it'll be more difficult to trace back kind of like what is the particular reason for the discrepancy. I think that what you can say is just, so we're using this one way of generating the results to compare with another way of generating the result, which is just theoretical, which is just prediction. And then we compare them. So that's certainly different from two methods of geological dating. It's a little bit more like our observation of like the irregularities of the planets orbits and stuff. And then you have to decide, you have to go back into the background and say, what were our assumptions, say, in our model of the background that allowed us to, like when we modeled all of the background interactions, what did we attribute to background versus signal, and does that need to be revised? So that has the analogy to kind of what Elisa Boklich was talking about in the sense that she's saying, okay, you're trying to deciding whether you should revise background information. And here the background information is the information that's going into every step of kind of constructing the model and then the optimization process and everything. So those have to be looked at. I wish I had the reference. I couldn't find it before this talk, but there's one where they went back and they looked and there was just some error in one of the statistical kind of in one of the software packages that they were using, there was just like an error that was kicking up something. And so it's the kind of thing that when you get these discrepancies, it basically just forces you to go back and do certain checks. That's one option, right? Yeah. Or you can just say there was this discrepancy because there are these uncertainties that we weren't able to account for, and we'll just chalk it up to a higher uncertainty than we thought. So yeah, there are analogies, but there's nothing kind of I don't think there's a direct analogy with any of these for that reason, if that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So one way, just to check if I got it, one way to say this is if you take the metrologic, the language of the metrologists, then one way to say what you're saying is that the analogy is on the level of the coherence test, but not on the level of the consilience argument.
Yeah, not the consilience. Okay. But I do think that the coherence testing and the calibration are much more mixed in this case than in kind of the way that the radiographic example, because Elise Boklich is one of the ones who tried to distinguish these things, but for her, she said coherence comes first, then we do calibration and whatever else. So I think that here, these examples are not, I didn't really talk about consilience. I don't think there's stuff, I didn't talk about anything happening at the consilience level, but both coherence and calibration are playing a role, but it's more mixed and entangled.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question, which I'll, again, abuse my position as moderator. So this is a very general question, but in relation to similar questions arising in other fields, I'm wondering if you've looked at all at the so-called replication crisis and the open science initiatives that people have followed after that, because there's a lot of things that get bundled into that as things that are seen as, best practices. And is blind analysis something that people talk about in that context?
From the practices so actually I've seen mixed reactions. So as I said, one of the physicists who was active when he was talking about these co-wrote with a psychologist who, again, at the time, it's a bit dated now. When they wrote that, they were saying psychologists don't really do this. And then, again, just anecdotally, so this is not an argument, but just anecdotally, when I've talked to a couple kind of social scientists or psychologists, they're like, oh, but it's totally different because you have models of what kinds of bias, you have statistical models in physics of what kinds of biases you can expect. And so there are ways in which that doesn't apply. But at the same time, at the last time, it seemed to me, again, just seeing someone give a talk at the PSA who was working with psychologists, they had started to pick up on this. Oh, this is a thing, a statistical analysis that happens in physics. Maybe that could actually be something. So it seems like, at least from what I've seen so far, some are open to it, but there hasn't been a lot of kind of anything developed on it, because the best practices that I've seen in that context are more pre-registration, with the trying to prevent p-hacking, things like that. And it's not, so I haven't seen kind of direct applications of this kind of thing, again, for reasons that some people have defended by saying the kinds of models to describing our data are different in psychology than in physics. But I still have questions about that.
Good. Any other questions for Maury? Oh, sorry.
This is now a follow-up, but it originally was not going to be because you hadn't said it yet. I wonder if there's a closer relationship between this and pre-registration, or like you just
Okay,
sort of say more about how you. I mean, I think of the point of pre-registration as not just about p-hacking, but generally that we want to specify what all of our analyses are going to be prior to even collecting the data.
Yeah, no, actually you're right, because as I said, since there are different like reactions to what might happen, it's not that the internal review, say at Babar, will say, no, you can't publish if your blind analysis didn't come out the way that you thought. They will, but kind of the principle is, at least you should have thought about the options before you unblind. And then once you unblind, you say kind of everything that you found. You don't retune and then give the new result. So in that sense, yeah, there's like kind of the underlying principle but with pre-registration has that similarity with kind of the ethos, I think, of at least at Babar as they've explained it so far. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, please join me in thanking Molly.